My nervous mistake turned into the turning point of my entire journey, and I still remember the day as if it is stitched into the walls of my heart because nothing in my life had ever felt so terrifying or so important. And when I stepped onto that stage, my legs were shaking, my throat felt tight, and my heart was racing like it wanted to escape from my chest, yet I still tried to act brave even though I felt like a fragile piece of glass, pretending to be a mountain as the bright lights hit my face. And the audience went silent. I could hear every tiny sound inside my body, and I feared that everyone could hear it too. And when I opened my mouth to start my performance, my voice cracked in a way that felt like the universe had broken inside me, and I panicked so deeply that for a moment I could not breathe, and the room began to spin, and I wanted to run away and hide forever because in that instant I felt like the most foolish person alive who dared to believe they could shine on a stage built for confident people. Yet while I stood there frozen in fear, I heard a small sound from someone in the crowd, a soft encouraging hum that felt like a gentle hand reaching out to pull me from the darkness, and it gave me the courage to inhale deeply and try again even though my heart was trembling harder than before. And when I pushed out the next word, it came out rough and broken, but it was real and honest and full of every emotion I had been carrying in secret for so long. And the more I spoke, the more I felt the pieces of my fear loosening like chains, falling away one by one, and the audience slowly leaned in as if they wanted to hear every fragile bit of truth I was spilling out. And for the first time in my life, I realized that being imperfect did not mean I was weak, because sometimes the imperfect moments reveal the strongest parts of us. And as I continued my performance, something inside me shifted like a locked door opening for the first time, letting in fresh air and light, and I felt myself becoming someone new, someone braver, someone who was not afraid of breaking in front of others, because breaking could also mean becoming. And when I finished, the room was quiet for a moment, a deep, thoughtful quiet that felt like the world was holding its breath, and then applause started rising softly, then stronger, like a wave building strength before reaching the shore. And when I walked off the stage, my hands were still shaking, but they were shaking with relief and pride instead of fear. And I had no idea that someone in the audience had recorded the entire thing and posted it online, where it traveled faster than I could ever imagine, reaching thousands of people who felt the same fear, who faced the same trembles, who needed the same push. And as the views grew and the comments poured in filled with messages of support and love and strength, I realized that my nervous mistake had become a message of courage for people I had never met. And that single moment that once felt like the most humiliating second of my life became the spark that lit my confidence, and everything after that day began to change for me, because I learned that your journey does not start when you shine perfectly, but when you dare to keep going even as you shake and even as you stumble. And now when I look back, I feel grateful for that mistake, because without it I would have never discovered the bravery buried inside me, waiting for a reason to rise, and I would have never known that a trembling voice can still move hearts, that a broken moment can still carry beauty, and that the most powerful journeys begin in the places where we fear we are falling apart. After that day, everything around me began to feel different, because I was no longer moving through life as the frightened person who avoided challenges. Instead, I started walking with a quiet strength that I had never felt before. And even though I was still scared, sometimes I refused to let fear control me again. And as days passed, people who had seen the video started reaching out to me with words that shook my heart in the best way. They told me that my trembling voice had given them courage. They said that seeing me stand there scared yet still continuing made them believe that they too could stand up again. And that thought filled me with a warmth I had never known, because all my life I believed my weakness made me invisible, yet now my vulnerability was helping others find their own light. And when I returned to school, some people looked at me differently, not with pity but with a kind of respect or maybe gratitude, and a few who used to laugh at me now avoided my eyes, not because they felt superior but because they realized that courage is not loud or perfect, it is quiet and human and real. And I saw something change in them too, like they finally understood that everyone carries their own battles deep inside, and that a moment of laughter at someone else's pain can become a lifetime of regret. And as the days turned into weeks, I kept practicing and performing, not because I wanted fame but because I finally felt connected to myself in a way I never had before. And every time I stood on a stage, I remembered how tightly fear once held me, and how I broke free from it, and that memory kept me grounded and grateful. And then one evening, when the sun was melting into the horizon, painting the sky with soft gold and fading purple, I received a message from a young girl who said she had been afraid to speak in her class for years, but after watching me, she gathered the courage to raise her voice for the first time, and her teacher praised her, and she cried with happiness. And reading that message made my heart swell until I felt it might overflow, because I realized that my journey was no longer just mine, it was becoming a path of hope for others too. And that thought made every painful moment worthwhile. And as my following online continued to grow, I knew I had to be honest with the people who believed in me, so I began sharing more of My story telling them about the nights when I cried into my pillow thinking I would never be enough, the mornings when I felt so small that I wished I could disappear, the days when I avoided speaking because I feared judgment, and slowly I noticed something beautiful. People from everywhere began sharing their stories with me too, telling me about their own fears, their own broken moments, their own battles, and together we created a space where no one had to pretend to be perfect. And that was when I realized that the turning point of my journey had never been about fame or recognition. It had been about the courage to be human and the strength to keep going even when everything in me felt like giving up. And as I continued walking this path, I felt my heart growing softer and stronger at the same time, like a tree that bends in storms yet refuses to break because its roots run deep. And with every message, every connection, every voice that reached out to me, I understood that my story was not just something that happened to me. It was something that was shaping me and guiding me toward a version of myself that I once believed I could never become. As time moved forward, I kept discovering new layers of myself that I never knew existed, because every message, every moment of connection, every small bit of support reminded me that I was walking on a path that had opened only because I dared to stand again after falling. And there were nights when I sat alone in my room staring at the soft glow of the screen, reading the words of strangers who felt like distant friends, telling me how my story helped them breathe easier. And those nights filled my heart with a deep, slow warmth that spread through my entire body and made me feel like I was no longer alone in the world. And the more I shared, the more honest I became, even when my honesty felt heavy, because I knew someone out there needed to hear that they were not the only one afraid, and I wanted them to know that fear was not something to be ashamed of, but something to walk through slowly, step by step. And as I continued performing at small events and gatherings, I noticed that I no longer shook the way I once did. Instead, I carried myself with a quiet, steady confidence that grew from the deep understanding that mistakes do not define us, only our willingness to rise after them. And every stage I stepped on became a reminder of the day I thought everything was over, and how that moment had shaped my destiny in ways I never imagined. And one afternoon, while I was preparing for another performance, a teacher approached me and told me that the school wanted me to speak to the younger students as someone who had faced fear and turned it into strength. And hearing that made my heart flutter with a mix of disbelief and gratitude, because only a short time ago I had felt unworthy of being noticed, and now they wanted me to guide others. And when I stepped into that classroom filled with small, hopeful faces, I felt something powerful inside me, like a gentle light rising from my chest. And I told them about the night my voice cracked and how I almost ran away, and how standing still for just one more heartbeat changed everything. And the children listened with wide eyes and soft breaths. And when I finished, a little boy raised his hand and said that he had always been scared to raise his voice in front of people, but hearing me made him believe that maybe he could try. And that moment touched me so deeply that I felt tears gathering behind my eyes, but I held them back and smiled gently, because I knew that this was the true purpose of my journey. And as I walked home afterward, the sky stretched above me like a calm, endless blanket, and I felt something peaceful settle inside me, a quiet truth that I was exactly where I needed to be, that every mistake had led me here, that every fear had shaped me, and that the journey of finding myself had only just begun. As days passed into a steady, quiet rhythm, I found myself growing more connected to the person I was becoming, because every moment, every decision, every step I took felt like it was pushing me further away from the scared, trembling version of myself, and guiding me towards someone who understood the value of courage in the smallest actions. And even though there were still moments when doubt whispered in the back of my mind, I refused to let it dominate my spirit, because I had already walked through the darkest part of my fear, and I knew that if I survived that, then I could survive anything that came next. And I started spending evenings practicing my voice, not because I feared failure, but because I had finally learned to love the process of growing. And as my voice grew stronger, so did my heart. And I began to realize that confidence was not a sudden burst of bravery, but a slow, gentle unfolding of trust in yourself. And one evening, while sitting by the window listening to the distant sounds of life moving outside, I received a message from someone who said that they had replayed my performance every night before sleeping because it made them feel like they were not alone in their struggles. And reading those words felt like a soft hand resting over my heart. And I understood once again that the world is filled with people who hide their battles behind quiet smiles, and sometimes all they need is a reminder that courage still exists, even in trembling voices. And days later, I was invited to a small community event where they wanted me to speak and perform, and even though the crowd was not huge, the room carried a peaceful energy that felt safe and warm. And as I stood in front of them, something inside me softened, and I spoke not with fear but with honesty, telling them about the night I broke on stage and how that moment became the beginning of everything. And the audience listened with stillness and kindness. And after the event, an elderly woman approached me with gentle eyes filled with a lifetime of stories, and she said that she too had spent years hiding her voice because she feared judgment, but watching me made her believe that it is never too late to step into your own strength, and her words wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket, and I felt another layer of healing settle inside me. And when I walked home that night, the world around me felt softer, like every leaf, every streetlight, every shadow was cheering for me in a quiet way. And I looked up at the sky, feeling the depth of its endlessness, and I realized that my journey was no longer defined by the moment I stumbled, but by every step I took afterward, every breath, every heartbeat that carried me forward. And I knew that even if the road ahead held challenges, I would face them with the strength that my mistake had taught me, and with the courage that had bloomed inside me ever since. As more time passed, I began to understand something deeper about myself, because every experience, every challenge, and every quiet moment of reflection revealed pieces of my heart that had been hidden beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. And I realized that the person I was becoming was shaped not by perfection but by resilience and the willingness to rise again each time I stumbled. And one afternoon, while I was walking through the school courtyard, the sunlight filtered through the leaves above me, creating soft shifting patterns on the ground, and in that peaceful silence I felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief at how far I had come, because there was a time not too long ago when I could barely speak without trembling, yet now people approached me to ask for advice, to share their fears, to seek comfort, and each conversation felt like a gentle reminder that healing is not a lonely path, because when you open your heart, others find the courage to open theirs too. And during one of those days, a boy who had once laughed at me during my first performance approached me hesitantly, his eyes carrying a weight I had never seen before. And he told me that he had made fun of me out of his own insecurity because he had been afraid to try anything himself. And watching my journey made him realize that courage is not about pretending to be stronger than others, but about fighting the battles within your own heart. And hearing that transformed a small painful memory into a moment of forgiveness and growth. And as he walked away, I felt another piece of my past settle peacefully into place, reminding me that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who fear themselves the deepest. And slowly I began receiving more invitations to speak at local events, each time spreading the message that mistakes are not endings but beginnings. And with each gathering I felt my voice becoming clearer and bolder, like a river that once trickled nervously, now flowing steadily toward the open sea. And the more I embraced my journey, the more opportunities came my way. And one evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of blue, I received a message from the organizers of a regional youth event inviting me to perform and share my story on a stage much larger than anything I had ever stepped on before. And instead of fear, my first reaction was a quiet thrill that rippled through my entire being, because this time I knew I was ready, not because I had become perfect, but because I had learned to trust myself through the imperfections. And when the day of the event finally arrived, I stood backstage listening to the soft hum of the crowd beyond the curtains, and for a moment I closed my eyes, feeling the steady rise and fall of my breaths. And in that stillness I saw my past self trembling under the bright lights of my first performance, and I whispered inside my mind that I was proud of that version of me, because without that trembling child I would not be standing here today with this new strength growing in my heart. And when the curtain lifted and I stepped forward into the glowing light, I carried not fear but a deep sense of purpose, knowing that everything I had endured had brought me to this moment where my voice could reach others who stood in the same shadows I once lived in. When I stepped onto that larger stage, the lights washed over me in a soft golden glow, and for a moment the world felt completely still, as if every sound, every thought, every heartbeat wanted to pause and listen. And as I looked out at the audience, I felt something powerful rise inside me, a mixture of gratitude and strength and quiet determination that wrapped around my heart like a warm, steady pulse. And I knew that this moment was more than a performance. It was a reflection of every fear I had fought, every tear I had hidden, and every step I had taken toward becoming someone braver than I once believed possible. And when I began to speak, the room settled into a gentle silence, and I poured my story out with a raw honesty that came straight from the deepest part of my soul. And everything I had once been afraid to admit felt like it was finally finding a safe place to live. And as I shared my journey, the audience did not look at me with judgment or pity, but with understanding and connection, as if they too had walked through their own storms and were silently standing beside me in spirit. And when I finished speaking, I shifted into my performance, letting my voice rise, carefully carrying every emotion, every memory, every moment of healing that had shaped me into who I was now. And as the words flowed out of me, I felt the weight of my past releasing itself piece by piece, like shadows melting away at sunrise. And for the first time in my life, I sang not to prove anything and not to impress anyone, but simply to express the truth inside me. And when the final note faded, the room stayed still for a breath before erupting into a wave of applause that felt warmer than anything I had ever known. And as I stood there absorbing the moment, tears threatened to fall, yet they were not tears of fear or shame, they were tears of pride and relief and overwhelming gratitude, because I realized that the mistake I once wished I could erase had grown into the very foundation of my courage. And after the event, people approached me with soft smiles and gentle words, telling me that my story made them feel brave enough to look at their own fears differently, and a few even shared stories of their own trembling moments, and each one felt like a small lantern lighting up the path of human connection. And as the night sky stretched itself across the world outside, I walked home, with a steady calm in my chest, knowing that I had stepped into a new chapter of my life, one built not on perfection but on resilience, honesty, and the quiet bravery of showing up, even when my voice shakes. After that night, my world began to expand in ways I never imagined possible, because something inside me had shifted so deeply that I could no longer return to the quiet, scared version of myself that once trembled under the weight of every single doubt. And as the days moved forward, I discovered that confidence is not a loud fire but a steady flame that grows with every moment you refuse to give up. And every morning when I woke up, I felt a new sense of purpose pulling me out of bed, guiding me into a day that no longer felt like a burden but like an opportunity to keep becoming the person I had always dreamed of being. And even though fear still whispered at the edges of my thoughts, I no longer let it decide my path, because I had seen with my own eyes what happens when you walk forward anyway. And every step I took from that point on felt like a soft rebellion against the version of me that the world tried to shape with judgment and doubt. And whenever I felt myself slipping into old patterns, I would close my eyes and remember the sound of applause that rose for me on that larger stage, the warmth of those voices, the way my heart finally felt free. And I would remind myself that one moment of courage can rewrite the entire story of your life. And as weeks turned into months, people began inviting me to more events, not only to perform but to speak and share my journey, because they said there was a strength in my honesty that touched hearts and made others feel seen. And I started meeting people of all ages who carried their own hidden fears and wounds inside them. And when they opened up to me, I felt a deep responsibility to carry their stories gently within my heart and reflect back to them the truth that I had learned through my own pain, that our value does not fade when we fall, and that even broken voices can heal others. And one day, while traveling to a youth conference in a nearby city, I sat quietly by the window of the bus, watching the road stretch endlessly ahead. And I thought about how different my life had become because of one mistake that once felt like the end of everything but had instead become the beginning of something far greater than I had ever dared to dream. And at that conference I met hundreds of young people, each one carrying a spark of hope inside them. And when I stepped onto that stage to share my story, I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude, because I realized that my voice was no longer trembling, it was steady and alive and full of the fire that had grown from every moment I refused to let fear win. And as I spoke to them, I saw tears in some of their eyes, and I saw quiet nods and soft smiles, and I felt connected to them in a way that went deeper than words, because we were all just human beings trying to heal from something, trying to rise, trying to breathe freely in a world that often tries to tell us we are not enough. And after my speech, a girl approached me with shaking hands, and she said she had been hiding her voice for years because she believed no one would understand her. But after hearing me, she felt a strange new courage growing in her chest, and she wanted to try speaking for the first time. And when she walked away, I felt a profound warmth settle into my soul, like a seed of light that would continue growing for the rest of my life. And later that day, as I sat alone backstage, the echo of the audience still dancing in my ears, I realized that my journey had become bigger than performances, bigger than stages, bigger than the fear I once thought would crush me. And I understood that the mistake that once felt like a storm destroying everything had been the rain that helped me grow. And as I traveled home that night, the sky outside the window stretched in endless darkness, yet it did not feel empty. It felt vast and full of possibility. And I rested my head against the glass, feeling the gentle hum of the bus and thinking about how life can change in ways you never expect when you choose bravery over fear. And from that moment on, I promised myself that I would continue walking this path, even when it felt difficult, even when doubt tried to pull me back, because I knew that the world needed more voices that refused to be silenced and more hearts willing to share their truth. And as the days kept passing, I continued to perform, I continued to speak, I continued to heal. And every time someone told me that my story helped them find strength, I felt the faint tremble of my past self. But instead of fear, it was pride, because I had grown from that trembling child into someone who could carry others through their own darkness. And this journey became the most important part of my life, guiding me, shaping me, and reminding me every single day that our greatest turning points often rise from the moments we once believed were our greatest failures. And with each passing moment, I felt my heart stretching wider, opening to a future that no longer frightened me but called to me with the gentle promise that I had so much more to give and so much more to become. And even now as I look back on everything that has happened, I know without question that my nervous mistake was not a curse but a gift, because it led me forward into a life filled with purpose, connection, courage, and a truth I will carry forever. The truth that we do not rise despite our fears. We rise through them, and because of them, one breath, one step, one trembling moment at a time. As the months continued to unfold, I found myself stepping into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply comforting, because for the first time in my life I was no longer running from the sound of my own voice. Instead, I was learning to trust it, to follow it, to let it guide me toward places I never believed I would reach, and every day brought new experiences that tested the strength I had built from that single moment of vulnerability. And whenever doubt tried to creep back into my mind, I would remind myself of every stage I had stood on, every face that had watched me with hope, and every person who had messaged me saying that my journey made them feel less alone, and each reminder became a soft anchor that held me steady as I moved forward. And one evening, while preparing for another performance, I sat in front of the mirror looking at my reflection, and I realized something that made my breath grow. Still, I no longer saw the scared, trembling child who had once felt small beneath the glow of harsh stage lights. Instead, I saw someone who had learned to rise again and again, someone who understood that fear is not the enemy but a silent teacher that pushes us toward growth. And as I stared into my own eyes, I felt a quiet pride growing in my chest, a pride that was not loud or boastful but warm and deeply rooted. And that night when I stepped onto the stage, I carried that pride with me, letting it flow through my voice, letting it guide my steps, letting it fill every corner of the room with the truth of who I had become. And afterward, a group of young students approached me eagerly, each one carrying a piece of their own fears in their voices. And they told me that they wanted to start a small club dedicated to helping others speak confidently. And they asked if I would guide them, and hearing that made my heart swell with a feeling so deep that I could barely form words, because I realized that my journey was no longer only about myself. It was a bridge connecting me to others who needed a little light to guide their way. And I agreed with a soft nod, and together we began meeting every week, gathering in a quiet room where we shared stories, practiced speaking, and encouraged each other to grow. And every session felt like a small miracle, because I watched shy faces begin to lift, I watched hesitant voices begin to strengthen, and I watched hearts that once folded in fear begin to open slowly and gently. And through helping them, I found myself healing in new ways, because teaching others to find their courage reminded me of the courage I had been building inside myself. And as weeks passed, I grew close to them, feeling responsible for their dreams, their struggles, and their slow transformation. And one day, one of the quietest members of the group stood up during our session, her hand shaking slightly, and she began sharing a story she had kept hidden for years. And even though her voice trembled, it carried a strength that touched everyone in the room. And when she finished, tears shone in her eyes, yet they were tears of relief, not fear. And she told me that she never would have spoken if she had not watched my journey, and hearing that felt like a gift, a reminder that every painful step of my own path had given someone else permission to speak. And as the group grew stronger, so did I, and soon the school invited us to hold a larger event, where the members could perform or share their stories with others. And on the day of that event, I stood at the back of the room watching each student walk onto the stage with nervous determination. And as their voices rose and their stories unfolded, I felt tears gathering in my eyes, because I realized that this moment, this gathering, this strength blooming across the room was all born from a mistake I once wished I could erase. And when the event ended, the applause that filled the air felt like a warm embrace wrapping around every one of us. And afterward, as the room slowly emptied and the echoes of laughter and relief faded into the evening, I stayed behind for a few minutes, letting the reality of everything settle quietly in my heart. And I knew then that my journey had changed forever, that I was no longer defined by that nervous mistake, but by everything that had grown from it, the people I had touched, the lives that had been lifted, and the courage that kept expanding inside me, like a never-ending sunrise filling every shadow with light. As the months continued to unfold, I found myself stepping into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply comforting, because for the first time in my life I was no longer running from the sound of my own voice. Instead, I was learning to trust it, to follow it, to let it guide me toward places I never believed I would reach. And every day brought new experiences that tested the strength I had built from that single moment of vulnerability. And whenever doubt tried to creep back into my mind, I would remind myself of every stage I had stood on, every face that had watched me with hope, and every person who had messaged me saying that my journey made them feel less alone. And each reminder became a soft anchor that held me steady as I moved forward. And one evening, while preparing for another performance, I sat in front of the mirror looking at my reflection, and I realized something that made my breath grow. Still, I no longer saw the scared, trembling child who had once felt small beneath the glow of harsh stage lights. Instead, I saw someone who had learned to rise again and again, someone who understood that fear is not the enemy but a silent teacher that pushes us toward growth. And as I stared into my own eyes, I felt a quiet pride growing in my chest, a pride that was not loud or boastful but warm and deeply rooted. And that night when I stepped onto the stage, I carried that pride with me, letting it flow through my voice, letting it guide my steps, letting it fill every corner of the room with the truth of who I had become. And afterward, a group of young students approached me eagerly, each one carrying a piece of their own fears in their voices. And they told me that they wanted to start a small club dedicated to helping others speak confidently. And they asked if I would guide them, and hearing that made my heart swell with a feeling so deep that I could barely form words, because I realized that my journey was no longer only about myself. It was a bridge connecting me to others who needed a little light to guide their way. And I agreed with a soft nod, and together we began meeting every week, gathering in a quiet room where we shared stories, practiced speaking, and encouraged each other to grow. And every session felt like a small miracle, because I watched shy faces begin to lift, I watched hesitant voices begin to strengthen, and I watched hearts that once folded in fear begin to open slowly and gently. And through helping them, I found myself healing in new ways, because teaching others to find their courage reminded me of the courage I had been building inside myself. And as weeks passed, I grew close to them, feeling responsible for their dreams, their struggles, and their slow transformation. And one day, one of the quietest members of the group stood up during our session, her hand shaking slightly, and she began sharing a story she had kept hidden for years. And even though her voice trembled, it carried a strength that touched everyone in the room. And when she finished, tears shone in her eyes, yet they were tears of relief, not fear. And she told me that she never would have spoken if she had not watched my journey. And hearing that felt like a gift, a reminder that every painful step of my own path had given someone else permission to speak. And as the group grew stronger, so did I. And soon the school invited you as to hold a larger event where the members could perform or share their stories with others. And on the day of that event, I stood at the back of the room watching each student walk onto the stage with nervous determination. And as their voices rose and their stories unfolded, I felt tears gathering in my eyes, because I realized that this moment, this gathering, this strength blooming across the room was all born from a mistake I once wished I could erase. And when the event ended, the applause that filled the air felt like a warm embrace wrapping around every one of us. And afterward, as the room slowly emptied and the echoes of laughter and relief faded into the evening, I stayed behind for a few minutes, letting the reality of everything settle quietly in my heart. And I knew then that my journey had changed forever, that I was no longer defined by that nervous mistake, but by everything that had grown from it. The people I had touched, the lives that had been lifted, and the courage that kept expanding inside me like a never-ending sunrise, filling every shadow with light. The moral of this story is that our mistakes and fears are not signs of weakness but stepping stones toward growth and self-discovery. The moment we stumble or feel embarrassed is often the very moment that shapes our courage and teaches us resilience. Life does not demand perfection. It demands persistence and honesty with ourselves. Every nervous step, every trembling voice, and every failure carries a hidden lesson that can transform fear into strength and hesitation into confidence. True bravery is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. When we embrace our vulnerabilities, we create opportunities for connection and inspire others to confront their own struggles. One small act of courage can ripple far beyond our imagination, touching lives we may never see and creating hope where it was once absent. The story also teaches that self-worth is not measured by how flawless we appear in the eyes of others, but by our commitment to rise after setbacks and keep moving forward, even when uncertainty looms. Mistakes are not endings, they are beginnings that guide us toward the person we are capable of becoming. Sharing our journey openly allows others to feel seen and understood, turning individual struggles into collective strength. The nervous moments, the failures, the embarrassment, all of these are part of the path that leads to personal growth, emotional maturity, and authentic confidence. Ultimately, the story reminds us that life's most powerful lessons are often found in our most uncomfortable experiences, and that courage, once cultivated, can transform our lives and the lives of those around us in ways that fear could never have predicted.